From when the Emperor of Heaven called me to the rulership of this great empire on earth, nobody saw my spear at rest. I kept vigilant through the whole span of my life, guarding the children of New Rome, marching bravely to the west, and as far as the very frontiers of the east. And now, good man, looking upon my tomb, reward it with prayers in return for my campaigns. Welcome to History's Influence. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe. We're less than 500 subscribers away from our 10,000 subscriber goal. I'd also like to give a big shout out to my patrons, Dark Age Sage, Sir Procopio, and 2 Jacks and an Ace. Now, onto the video. The Byzantine Empire was the direct continuation of the Roman Empire, a sophisticated, centralized, imperial domain originally birthed from the crisis of the Roman Republic. In 476 AD, the western division of the empire had fallen, and in the 7th century, some of the wealthiest provinces were lost to the Arabs, and much of the Balkans were lost to the Slavs. The empire would face endemic raiding for centuries as a result. By the Dark Ages, the empire's population had become predominantly Greek-speaking and Christian, yet they still identified as Romans and maintained Roman law and customs. Persevering for centuries from their impenetrable capital of Constantinople and defensive heartland of Anatolia, their enemies would begin to recede in the 10th century, allowing for a period of Roman reconquest. This medieval apogee reached its peak under the warrior emperor Basil II, who first crushed internal revolt, and then would go on to annex foes such as the persistent and centuries-long enemy of the Bulgarian Empire. But Byzantium would face a gradual decline in the decades following this medieval apogee. Incompetent or illegitimate emperors struggled to hold onto the throne, utilizing heavy bribery to maintain their rule, with the Macedonian dynasty Basil belonged to going extinct in 1056. At the same time, attacks from new groups such as the Normans in Sicily, Pechenegs in the Balkans, and Seljuk Turks to the east were intensifying. These groups began to form an existential threat to the empire. The disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071 sparked a full-blown fiscal crisis and civil war, creating a gaping hole in defense that Seljuk generals and leading Turkoman tribesmen used to migrate into Anatolia. Check out my video on the battle for more details. The loss of Anatolia had permanently weakened Byzantium, and whilst noble attempts of restoration had been attempted by the likes of the Komnenos and Paleologus dynasties, Constantinople would eventually succumb to Ottoman Turkish conquest in 1453, signalling the end of an empire. But what if this never happened? What if the disaster at Manzikert was prevented, with a more robust Byzantine Empire, meaning they could preserve their defensible heartland of Anatolia, and so possibly reverse their decline and eventual fall? What if the Byzantine Empire survived? Speaking of keeping your empire secure, I'm thrilled to introduce Private Internet Access, sponsor of this video and my personal VPN of choice, which acts as an impregnable citadel for my online privacy. Unlike Constantinople's walls in 1453, a virtual private network will hide your IP address and encrypt your internet connection, keeping your activity invisible to your internet service provider, network administrators, and government censors. PIA is the world's most transparent VPN with over 30 million downloads. They never record or log user data, which has been proven in court repeatedly and verified with an independent audit by Deloitte. PIA unblocks all major streaming services by allowing you to change your device's geolocation so you can access content you can't see in your home country. You can check out Manzikert 1071, Doomsday for the Byzantines, a Turkish historical drama with English subtitles, which is usually only available for a select few countries, simply by changing your geolocation to Germany. PIA also works on all platforms and can protect an unlimited amount of devices simultaneously. Plus, PIA even supports peer-to-peer file sharing. You can grab private internet access right now at 83% off by clicking my link in the description or pinned comment. That's only $2.03 per month with an extra 4 months free. This amazing deal is also risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. Head to piavpn.com/historiesinfluence to safeguard your internet privacy. The first point of departure I contemplated for this video started with Basil II being granted a legitimate male heir, who, unlike Basil's elderly brother or infertile nieces, would be capable of continuing the Macedonian dynasty in perpetuity. This would help prevent the crisis in legitimacy and overspending that developed in the decades following Basil's death. But to override Basil's refusal to marry in our timeline, or to marry off his nieces historically, we will have to assume that his brother Constantine has a son instead of only 2 daughters. It's possible that Basil's style of isolated, micromanaging rule may cause him to isolate the heir as well, fearing a potential coup in the military if the heir serves in the army, as he could be used as a puppet for a potential revolt. Or perhaps the heir will have early designs on the throne himself. Or Basil may fear the influence of in-laws if he marries off his nephew, like he did with his nieces. Although a male heir could still have children at a later age. If this isolation makes the heir unable to gain military experience, he will need to bribe non-military interest groups, such as the court, church, etc. It would be hard to make long-term predictions based on such speculation, however, and a legitimate Macedonian leader would help reduce the need for bribery, at least somewhat. Although the quality of future emperors wouldn't be known either. In addition to this unpredictability, the Macedonian dynasty lasted 189 years historically, being the longest lasting Roman dynasty by this point in history. To expect it to last longer without trouble or serious civil wars, or an overthrow of the dynasty, appears too idealistic. Moreover, factionalism and the overthrowing of an emperor may still happen at an inopportune time, such as when the triple threat of the Normans, Pechenegs, and Seljuks start applying serious pressure. To help address these threats, I was thinking of having Basil live a few years longer, so he could use his well-oiled military machine to conquer Muslim-held Sicily, as he was planning to do before his death. Sicily held a large Greek-speaking population, would have had substantial taxes to collect, and was ideally situated for trade, a good power base to bolster the wealth of the empire. But even by Basil's death historically, the Normans were already beginning to establish a foothold in southern Italy, with mercenary service on both sides of the lengthy Lombard revolt during Basil's reign. Their first land acquisition came only 5 years after Basil's death, albeit outside of the Byzantine borders. Now in this new timeline, it's true that they wouldn't have the same opportunity to serve in later Byzantine campaigns as mercenaries, like during the 1038 siege of Sicily, which helped the Normans grow far stronger. But potential rebellions of the Muslim minority in Sicily, or the Lombards in Apulia and Calabria, which happened during Basil's reign, may lead to mercenary service regardless. Additionally, Italy was the third priority of the Byzantine Empire, and so won't be defended as adamantly as other regions, especially if the Byzantines are preoccupied with the Seljuk Turks, Pechenegs, etc. And keep in mind, the Normans were opportunistic, internally competitive, and very skilled mercenaries and warriors. Their heavy cavalry charges consistently overpowered Byzantine forces. The Byzantines hadn't adjusted to the Norman style of warfare. So, it's not infeasible that the Normans would just conquer southern Italy anyway. These two benefits we've established for this point of departure won't provide a detailed understanding of how the empire could survive the 11th century with their heartland intact. But what if there exists another point of departure in which a new dynasty can be established, whose emperors we know would be capable of great leadership in the turbulent period before and after the Battle of Manzikert? Enter the Komnenos family. 12 years before Manzikert historically, it was the Seljuk dynasty who took charge of the Byzantine Empire, leading the empire to financial and military ruin, despite Romanus IV's attempt at recovery. But their first emperor, Constantine X Ducas, was in fact appointed by the previous emperor who died of an illness prematurely, Emperor Isaac Komnenos. Isaac had seized the throne by leading a revolt of disgruntled military families against Emperor Michael VI, and was later backed by the populace of Constantinople. Both groups apparently forced Isaac's hand, but despite this purported reluctance, Isaac proved to be a capable leader, pursuing rigorous fiscal reform in civil spending to face the empire's budget deficit head-on, whilst holding firm leadership over the military families. In this new timeline, we will assume that Isaac does not fall ill and abdicate in 1059. Instead, we will assume he lives to 1075. He will die at the age of 68, like Basil II had. This will give Isaac ample time to attempt to reverse the degradation of the empire, provide long-term stable rule, and to attempt establishing a new dynasty. The prospects for such a reign will strongly depend upon the Roman system Isaac will inherit. An older argument asserts that the Dynatoi, a land-holding magnate class, had begun to buy out small landowners and thereby dominate large estates in Anatolia, withholding taxes to the government as a proto-feudal aristocracy who by this point strongly influenced the state. This would imply that Isaac's fiscal efforts or ability to control the military would be drastically reduced in effectiveness with this informal system in place. But upon closer inspection, this seemingly natural process doesn't seem to have happened in the first place. We can't measure the scale of land ownership of the period since we don't have data, so there's no evidence on that front. There's also the argument that there was a reduction in military recruitment through peasants being put to work by land magnates, but again there's no actual evidence that this was the case. Additionally, emperors such as Nicephorus Phocas blocked landowning families from access to military-assigned lands, despite coming from a wealthy landowning background himself. If the emperor was part of such a class, wouldn't he want to boost his benefactors and support base? Furthermore, the emperor's attacks on landowners oppressing peasants with laws and propaganda don't necessarily imply some deep class divide with a strong Dynasty influence. These could be smaller cases being used for imperial propaganda, for example. In reality, power in Byzantium truly derived from the emperor himself. The Byzantine Empire by this point was the most centralized, bureaucratic, and sophisticated state in Europe. The emperor theoretically held unlimited power without being bound by the power of decentralized lords and other pesky feudal groups that you saw in Western Europe. People would gain power through attaining public office and honorific titles instead, assigned by the emperor himself. This applied to positions in military and civilian leadership, be it military generals, the court, senators, bureaucratic officials, church leadership, etc. Such an imperial structure bodes well for Isaac, reflected in his ability to enact effective reforms historically, but this Roman inheritance also came with a core weakness. Despite notions such as the emperor being chosen by God, there were no laws of succession determining who would be emperor, like in a traditional monarchy, thanks to the anti-monarchical sentiment of the Roman Republic the empire had inherited. The emperor was ultimately seen as a man with flaws. Despite theoretically holding supreme authority, numerous interest groups within the empire could test their power, or even cause their overthrow. The military was usually the greatest threat to imperial authority. Military assignments such as domestic of the schools gave far-reaching powers, which could then be used to attack the emperor's authority through military coups. Emperor Isaac assigned his loyal brother to this powerful role historically, which fares well for maintaining his own power. Periodic testing of imperial authority would occur due to such insecurity and legitimacy. Whenever interest groups believed they could challenge the emperor successfully, they would often attempt a coup, especially if the emperor removed them from a post they didn't wish to leave. The two revolts early in Basil II's reign are classic examples, alongside Basil's squabbling with his uncle, an independent-minded and powerful eunuch. So, in this new timeline, Isaac will need to ensure he holds firm control against such interest groups throughout his reign, so he is not overthrown or doesn't lose his head. A military coup against Isaac seems unlikely. Not only would his brother be domestic of the schools, but all of the key military families backed his revolt, and were loyal to him and his prioritization of military matters. Factionalism against him would likely favour civilian groups, which would not work to these families' interests. Additionally, Isaac's apparently cynical character will be helpful when facing internal threats as well. He was seen as being a dark cloud and few of words. This reflects Basil's style of leadership. Like Basil, Isaac's fierce and intimidating leadership will help keep potential enemies in line. Isaac will be busy with campaigns against enemies such as the Seljuks too, meaning he can distract the military with his central leadership, reducing the plotting of potential coups. And even though Isaac's position coming from a military coup may appear to make his position insecure, long-reigning emperors finding such a violent origin was not unprecedented, including dynastic founders. And it's clear from his reign historically that this did not prevent Isaac from maintaining a powerful political position. But of course, Isaac's historical reign didn't suit everyone. The civilian elite, including groups such as senators and clergymen, disliked Isaac's cutting of salaries, increasing of taxes, and the church didn't appreciate his reduction of tax exemptions. A rebellious Orthodox Christian patriarch did arise, but he was simply deposed and a loyalist was appointed in his place. He didn't hold true factional power against Isaac, which is standard for clergymen in Byzantine history. In a lengthier reign, Isaac will continue this pattern of replacing disloyal officials with loyal ones, helping establish a more loyal civilian elite. I don't see Isaac taking more drastic action against these groups in this new timeline than the initial reforms he already performed. The core work had already been done. It's also worth mentioning that Isaac was backed by members of the bureaucracy who were against the overspending and corruption that had grown in previous reigns. It's not as if every civilian official was opposed to Isaac. Looking past the civilian elites and focusing upon the broader populace, it's not only the populace of Constantinople which will back his leadership. The peasantry of the empire will appreciate Isaac's reforms, which reduced the encroachment of large landowning groups like the church upon peasant-held lands. It's possible that Isaac may need to raise peasant taxes, but I believe he would fixate on wealthier interest groups first, as he did historically, and peasant taxes would only be problematic if it was a drastic increase. This would depend on the budget section, which we'll be covering soon. Considering these factors, it's clear that Isaac will maintain power through military might, the prudent management of the numerous military families, gradually placating and replacing much of the disaffected civilian elites, alongside maintaining the approval of the commoners. Within this context, it's unlikely that Isaac will be facing existential rebellions, although there would be two key factors of policy which would define his reign itself and help secure the empire. The first would be his management of the budget, and secondly would be the defense of the empire against external enemies, most notably the Turks. Let's start with spending. Will Isaac be able to prevent the fiscal crisis which crippled Byzantium after Manzikert? Isaac was the first emperor after Basil that we can say for certain took measures to improve the budgetary deficit, which seemingly began as soon as Basil's reign ended. It's strange that a fiscal crisis occurred in the first place though, as the Byzantine Empire had been on a demographic and economic upswing for over a century by this point. The backdrop of weakening enemies, the reconquest of lands, and apparently ideal climatic conditions allowed for the resettling of the Aegean islands without Arab piracy, the growth of the economically diverse Anatolia without raids, the economic integration of new lands such as in Bulgaria, the flourishing of trade in the empire, aided by the ancient and sophisticated capital of Constantinople, etc. Large landowners such as major monasteries, churches, and the state itself invested in larger reclamation projects and the like, including the expansion of monasticism in southern Greece. Emerging merchant guilds and the like were increasing in prevalence, enough that they began to be recognized with court titles. They produced luxury goods such as silk and glass, whose processes also led to an increase of construction and shipbuilding work. There was also increasing monetization of the economy, a greater use of coinage, by the 11th century, which reflects an increase in trade and economic complexity, and provided the opportunity for more efficient tax collection. These developments we've discussed should imply that the state's budget would have been in surplus in this period, so what went wrong? Since Basil's death, a lack of imperial legitimacy plagued the empire, requiring emperors to grant concessions and bribes to a large degree, especially when new rulers would come to the throne. A pay-to-play system, worsened by excess spending in vain construction projects. Even the sponsoring of intellectuals contributed to this issue. Increased military spending, due to new threats arising, would worsen this issue substantially, leading to eventual fiscal crisis. But in this new timeline, Isaac's frugal civil spending, extended 16 years, will make a large difference in spending, aided by the fact that no new emperors will need to enact new rounds of bribery during the period. Isaac's targeting of landowning groups such as the church, through removing tax exemptions, etc., also mean that the proportion of tax collected won't be decreasing as it did historically under Isaac's successor Emperor Constantine X Ducas. Instead, Isaac would increase tax collection from such groups to help address the deficit. This would also include taxing the upcoming merchant class, who would serve as an increasing source of revenue for the empire. These groups won't be happy with such measures, of course, but Isaac's position of power will prevent them from raising too much of a fuss, and the worst damage would have been done already during his period of historical reign. But despite these benefits in civilian matters, military spending was always the primary expense for the state, and would be needed both for Isaac's backing and to address the new and dangerous foes on Byzantium's frontiers. Before Manzikert, the army had not transitioned to heavy mercenary usage yet, and recruitment issues don't seem to have existed either, so the army's affordability and composition wouldn't be compromised inherently. But it could be argued that the decades of mismanagement since Basil's death would be overwhelming, and despite Isaac's attempts, when combined with this high military spending, we'll be seeing the crippling of the empire's finances, regardless of Isaac's lengthier tenure in this new timeline. But I believe there are a few key counterpoints to consider. It's true that the budget was not in a broad surplus from Basil's death onwards, with a small devaluation of currency occurring, but the Byzantine currency only began to substantially devalue under Emperor Monomachus, an initial sign of a genuinely serious budget problem for Emperor Isaac to address directly. Also, whilst it's true that Constantine X's reversal of Isaac's policies reflect a tight budget, it still reflects the dynamic of a trade-off in which either civil or military spending could be prioritized, as opposed to compromising both. With Isaac's more efficient taxation and 16 more years of leadership as we've discussed, such issues will be alleviated further than there were in his merely 2-year reign historically. I believe such changes will make a substantial dent in the budget balance. The backdrop of economic growth, particularly with a lower degree of bribery and exemptions under Isaac, alongside a higher degree of tax collection, will provide great aid in preventing things from getting worse. I don't believe the currency will devalue nearly as much in this new timeline, for example. And without Constantine X reducing the military budget, the eastern frontier won't worsen as much as it did historically. This could prevent overly large armies from being raised in large-scale defense, like Emperor Romanus IV raised against the Seljuks for the Battle of Manzikert. There's a key point to remember with these arguments, however. We don't have exact figures on the budget of the period to come to a truly accurate opinion. But, in my view, Isaac's appropriate fiscal measures suggest that a serious crisis won't be occurring in this new timeline. Even if a budget surplus would be infeasible with high military spending, the deficit won't be nearly as strong. In the longer run, the positive economic developments we've discussed will pay major dividends for the empire, especially with the maintenance of Anatolia. But this assumes they can keep their holdings safe from the numerous threats they faced in this period. Speaking of, let's briefly discuss how Byzantium will fare against its enemies away from the eastern frontier. Emperor Isaac won't be able to prioritize Italy effectively enough to prevent the loss of the remaining Byzantine outposts, losing them in a similar time frame to how they did historically. The Norman power base in southern Italy was too powerful and effective by Isaac's reign, worsened by the fact that the Byzantines will still be preoccupied with closer to home enemies. This means the Normans could pose a threat to the Balkans from the 1080s onwards, as they did historically. Speaking of the Balkans, any Bulgarian revolts will still be squashed with an even more powerful Byzantium, and Hungary's temporary occupation of Belgrade will still be reversed. These successes still occurred historically, despite a weakening of defences. The Turkic Pechenegs were the greatest threat in the Balkans by this point, although Isaac had beat them to submission as nominal subjects historically. Isaac's personal attention and campaigns will keep them more strongly placated than they were historically after his death, but the distraction of the Seljuks and budgetary issues would make the prospect of a complete defeat difficult. It took decades longer for this to happen historically. We will assume Isaac does not pull it off within his own reign. Anyway, that's enough Balkan talk. Let's see how Isaac's empire fares against the Seljuk Turks along the eastern frontier. The Seljuks had been raiding up to Melitene by Isaac's reign historically. These raids had worsened enough to pose a serious threat to the eastern frontier. Autonomous Turkoman raiders, under the umbrella of the Seljuks, were the most persistent in such raiding, alongside Seljuk generals trying to earn favour with the Sultan. But interestingly, from the 1060s onwards, the Seljuk Sultans themselves began to seek diplomacy with Byzantium, more interested in conquering land elsewhere. But despite this, and thanks to the poor situation Byzantium found itself in, Emperor Romanus IV decided to instead attack the Seljuk army head-on to inflict a decisive defeat and dissuade the smaller groups from attacking Anatolia. In this new timeline, the eastern frontier will be far better maintained with better funding, as opposed to the defunding and degradation Constantine X oversaw. The emperor could assign loyal military families to the frontier, helping manage the serious Turkish threat and keep the families content in important positions. Isaac will also lead personal campaigns against the Turks, which may prove expensive but will be necessary for numerous reasons. Most of the raiders were autonomous Turkoman who bypassed fortifications to loot cities, and so Isaac will need to repel and discourage such deep raiding. Personal command would also perpetuate discipline and loyalty within the army, and project a strong image of power to his subjects more broadly to help keep them in line. This would include treacherous generals, such as Andronicus Ducas at the Battle of Manzikert historically. There also won't be that court factionalism that was occurring in the capital, so we won't feel a need to flee there anyway to play politics. It would also include relatively small yet unreliable mercenary contingents, such as the Normans. The Normans will be further discouraged in this new timeline since the army and defences would be better funded as well. Additionally, we will assume that Isaac's competent leadership would prevent disastrous battles or his death on the frontier, preventing the spark of a civil war or the exposure of the frontier. For example, the poor intelligence gathering and decision making of Emperor Romanus IV greatly contributed to the loss of Manzikert. But looking back at the new timeline, the combination of Byzantium's stronger defense, alongside the persistent Turkish raiding enduring in the short term, will allow for the Byzantines to better familiarize themselves with Seljuk battle tactics in this crucial period. Over the years, stronger fortifications and garrisons will be developed, bolstered by stronger communications lines. Defense in depth will be the standard, as it was under the persistent Arab raids, rather than the Byzantines merely defending at the frontiers themselves, with Isaac able to meet deeper penetrating armies personally. Cooperation with Georgians, Armenians and the like will still occur in this new timeline as well, which will be of great aid against the Turks. Speaking of cooperation, the Seljuk Sultans will still favour diplomacy from the 1060s onwards, they would still wish to invade elsewhere. Truces are more likely to be followed in this new timeline. The Byzantines would be more unappealing to attack or invade, and the Byzantines also wouldn't feel the same need to deliver a decisive defeat to secure the border. This would mean that Seljuk generals wouldn't earn favour with Byzantine raids within this context anymore, and such raiding would be more unappealing in this new timeline anyway. Turkoman raiders attacking Byzantium would become more diplomatically isolated as a result, and this isolation will make them more easy to defeat for the Byzantines. So, the factors we have considered, the emboldened army, strengthened frontier defences, and effective diplomacy, will allow the Byzantines not only to defend the border better, but also to better manage the population pressure of the Turkic migrations they had faced. This means that during Isaac's reign, Turkish raids will not deepen to the same extent, and the Turkish migration to Anatolia that happened from 1071 onwards after the Battle of Manzikert won't be occurring either. Keep in mind that despite the interior of Anatolia being ideal for the pastoralist lifestyle and settlement of the Turks would only settle in the region after the Battle of Manzikert historically, despite endemic raiding beforehand. And in this new timeline, the Turks won't focus as much on raiding Byzantium as they did historically, as it would be simply more difficult and less appealing. They would instead focus on raiding and potentially migrating to different areas, such as those controlled by the Fatimids. But this doesn't mean that the eastern borders of Byzantium will be unchanged forever. Despite the cooperation and annexation of Armenian lands, much of Armenia was so distant to Byzantine communication lines that the Turks will still hold a strong advantage. Even a relatively small crisis in Byzantium may initiate such an occurrence. So, Isaac has successfully balanced the budget and kept the Turkish threat at bay. But who will he be appointing as his successor? Will a Komnenian dynasty be established? Historically, Isaac's children died before he seized the throne, and his brother John was apparently disinterested in succeeding him after his death. But in this new timeline, John's children would have grown old enough to begin serving in the military. We will assume they still do. They did so historically under non-Komnenian emperors after all, as a way to accommodate the family. John had 5 sons and 3 daughters, but let's focus on the 3 eldest sons. John's eldest son Manuel will be assigned to heir by Isaac when he reaches maturity. He was an effective military leader, who would have been in his 20s by Isaac's death in theory. But he died of an illness historically in 1071, 4 years before Isaac's death in this new timeline that we're planning for. We will still assume he dies of an illness within a similar time frame. We've already given Isaac immunity. I don't want the entire family to have this special ability. John's second son may seem like the next heir to a point, but like what happened historically, we will assume that he's still outshined and therefore passed on for the third son, Alexios Komnenos. In our own timeline, Alexios would begin his military career in his early teens, later becoming the most powerful general in the Byzantine Empire, only to lead a coup and become emperor by age 24. He was one of the greatest emperors in Byzantine history, saving the empire from the brink of collapse following the aftermath of Manzikert, and initiating the Komnenian Restoration. In this new timeline, we will still assume he serves in the military in his early teens, with distinction. Emperor Isaac may have been a cynical character, but he will recognize Alexios' strong talent, and eventually assign him co-emperor and heir. Alexios would also hold other inherent benefits for Isaac. A young heir could perpetuate a long, stable reign, which would be important to keep the threat of the Turks at bay, alongside the threat of internal squabbling. However, Alexios will be 18 at Isaac's death in 1075. This wouldn't be too young. In the 1060s historically, Emperor Michael VII refused the throne at age 17, despite being considered able at that age. Alexios will instead be far more ambitious, as he was historically, and will be in his mid-teens by his older brother's death, old enough to be recognized for his military service. Furthermore, the person that will tip the scales to young Alexios' favor will be his mother Anna, who was quite the overbearing mother historically. Apparently, she begged her husband John to succeed the throne after Isaac's death, but he refused. She was also very determined to help Alexios seize the throne historically, and she would later hold strong influence in military and civil affairs during Alexios' reign, acting as a regent in the capital of Constantinople during his absences. In this new timeline, Anna will strongly encourage her brother-in-law Emperor Isaac to appoint Alexios' heir when Isaac would begin to show favour towards him. She would promise to act as a regent-like figure to help keep palace intrigues at bay. And so, at Emperor Isaac's death in 1075, it is Emperor Alexios Komnenos who will be declared Emperor of the Romans, which is where we will be ending this video. We've saved Byzantine Anatolia from its historical fate, leaving Alexios with a stronger empire to rule over. But dangers still loom, be it the persistent enemies that continue to surround the empire, or the powerful military families which may wish to seize Alexios' throne. Perhaps great reform will be needed, which Alexios pursued historically, where he created drastic changes that would redefine the Byzantine state and military. There's also the question of the Crusades. Without the loss of Anatolia, will the First Crusade still be initiated by Alexios' call for Western aid against the Turks? And will this still set the stage for disaster, like the partition of the empire following the Fourth Crusade in 1204? All these questions and more will be answered in the next part of this series. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the video, despite the slower pace than usual. This is the first time I actually feel like I over-researched for a series. I think it's going to end up being a 5-part series as a result. After part 2, we'll be mixing it alongside other content so I don't lose my sanity. Anyway, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you later.